Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this event this afternoon. My name is Johan Fleck, and I'm the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. It is my pleasure to welcome Michael McGrath, the Minister of Finance of Ireland, to the Atlantic Council. This event is an important edition of the Council's IMF World Bank Week, expertly organized by our colleagues at the Geoeconomic Center and in partnership with the Europe Center. This week's spring meetings are a chance for the world's finance ministers to convene and discuss the global economic outlook and what to do about it at a critical moment for the global economy. Ireland, Europe, the United States, and the world confront economic challenges stemming from sticky inflation, China's economic struggles, and wars in Europe and the Middle East in the near term, and rapid technological change, an increasingly urgent climate crisis, and growing geopolitical tensions in the longer term. Ireland, as a country, the IMF has concluded to be on track for a soft landing, and a country that is a member of the Eurozone and the EU, a small but open and export-oriented economy, has a key role to play in addressing these challenges. Just yesterday, Minister McGrath announced an additional 800 million euros in financing for international climate action and pandemic preparedness, which I'm sure we'll discuss in more detail shortly. Against this backdrop, the Minister joins us today to discuss Dublin's priorities for these spring meetings and for the EU's economic policies. This event is just one of many the Europe Center is co-hosting with the Geoeconomic Center, and I hope you can join us throughout the week as the Council becomes the go-to place for all discussions around the spring meetings. With that, Minister, thank you again for joining us. And over to my colleague, Charles Litchfield, Deputy Director of the Geoeconomic Center here at the Council, to moderate the conversation.
Thanks, Johan. It's indeed our great pleasure and honor to receive the Minister of Finance of Ireland, Michael McGrath. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Charles. My pleasure.
Having a very busy week. And it's, of course, the virtue of these meetings that you get to meet all your normal colleagues and then perhaps some slightly less usual colleagues, bumping into all sorts of people in the corridors. But you've walked all the way over to our headquarters at the Atlantic Council to tell us a little bit about the Irish economy, the European economy, and also what you want to achieve at these spring meetings. So we will talk about all those things, but I thought we could perhaps start with a few numbers. The WEO has been released, and Ireland's growth projection has been downgraded just a little bit. So I was wondering if you could tell us about some of the factors behind that. But then there's an Irish specificity about GDP, which is that sometimes it's better to look at gross national product in the Irish case. So perhaps you could explain to our audience that isn't that well informed on the European economy sometimes. Some of them are, some of them aren't. What the difference is. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Charles, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I mean, the good news from an Irish perspective is whatever measure you use, and there are different measures, we are anticipating growth in the Irish economy across this year and steady growth over the next number of years. The timing of this interview is good because next week we will publish revised macroeconomic and fiscal forecasts in what we call the Stability Programme Update, which under the old EU fiscal rules we were required to bring forward. And so while the IMF forecast is at the lower end of other independent forecasts of GDP growth in the Irish economy, we do use other measures as well, which we think better capture the underlying strength of the domestic economy in Ireland. So modified domestic demand, for example, or a particular construct of gross national income, GNI star. And in effect, it's where we strip out some of the inherent volatility in the Irish GDP numbers because of the outsized nature of foreign direct investment in Ireland, where you have contract manufacturing that happens abroad, for example. You have significant IP flows, you have repatriation of profits to foreign shareholders, non-domestic residents, and so on. So our own statistical agency have devised other measures that we think are a better reflection of the inherent health of the Irish economy, but we accept GDP is the internationally recognised metric, and of course we continue to publish our GDP numbers and our debt figures and everything in line with international norms, alongside metrics that we think tell us a little bit more about what's actually happening.
Okay, and why would you how would you explain that the economy has slowed down a little bit? So wonderful that it's growing, and not all economies in Europe are. That may be one of the reasons. Are there any other reasons why you think the outlook is just a little bit less good than it was a few months ago?
So there is volatility in GDP, and if you look at the sectors in the Irish economy where we have particular strength, and the outward focused international trade elements in life sciences, in tech, in international financial services. But if you take pharma in particular, we had a very significant COVID dividend because of the manufacture of some antiviral drugs, of vaccines in Ireland. And so last year we had a contraction in GDP and a contraction in export because of that COVID high point that was reached the year before. We think largely that has washed through the system now, and we are anticipating that there will be export growth in value and volume terms across 2024 and beyond. But I look at a number of other metrics, including the labour market, and we have a record number of people now working in Ireland. We've reached a new high water mark of over 2.7 million people. We added about 90,000 jobs in the economy last year. Public finances are in good health, and we are continuing to see investment flows coming into Ireland. Personal consumption has been resilient, notwithstanding interest rate policy, the challenge of inflation. We saw a significant amount of household savings developed during the COVID years, so it's up by about 40% from 2019, over 150 billion of household deposits there. So there is a lot of resilience in the Irish economy, very strong labour market, and an economy overall that is in good health, but is open, is trading, and so is dependent on the external environment, which of course has been very challenging and continues to be characterised by considerable uncertainty.
And maybe another source of uncertainty, which seems like it's coming from a different angle, given we've just talked about the growth, though it exists, slowing down a little bit. But some commentators who know the Irish economy well, including IFAC, the fiscal watchdog, have talked about a risk of overheating. Now, this is related to a question I wanted to ask you anyway on your new sovereign wealth fund, which is part of your attempt to manage that, in that if there is too much money going into the Irish state as fiscal returns, you're able to save it and use it for later, save it for a rainy day. I'm just curious what you think about this comment on overheating, which comes from a fairly established watchdog, whether you agree with it, and how this actually works. We're quite nerdy at the Geoeconomic Centre. We like looking at sort of equations and things like this. So how do you calculate from year to year what money goes into the national to the sovereign wealth fund, and what years you might be able to spend from it? Is there a rule, for instance?
Well, there are capacity constraints in the Irish economy for sure, labour being one of them, even though a lot of people are coming to Ireland for the employment opportunities and the very good quality of life that we offer in our country. The housing market is very challenging. We are continuing to increase supply, and we need to accelerate that because we have a growing population, and we have a lot of demand for housing. It's a significant social and economic issue. We're reforming our planning system, and there are bottlenecks that we are seeking to address, and we have to make sure that we remain competitive. So there are capacity constraints. I don't believe that there is a significant risk of overheating in the Irish economy. We've seen a moderation in growth, which we started the interview discussing a couple of years ago. GDP growth was almost 10% in Ireland, so it has moderated significantly, but that is because of the external environment. And we are seeing some early signs of a softening in the labour market in terms of new job postings and vacancies. So some of the high frequency data does point to a softening in that regard. So Ireland has a history of sovereign wealth funds in the sense that 30 years ago or so, a National Pension Reserve Fund was set up, and much of the funding that was accumulated in that ended up being used in the global financial crisis to recapitalise our banks. What remains of that is sitting in an Ireland Strategic Investment Fund, which we set up about 10 years ago. It's between 14 and 15 billion euro, which has a commercial mandate in terms of investment and is there to support the Irish economy, though it does have a global portfolio, and the funds in that are recycled then into investments in the Irish economy. But what you're referring to is a new initiative now to set up two new long-term funds. One is the Future Ireland Fund, which is not a rainy day fund because it is being set up to meet costs that are definitely coming your way. Essentially, the cost of an aging population, demographic related costs, the cost of digitalization, of climate change, but particularly demographics, pension costs, home care, healthcare costs. So we will put 0.8% of our GDP away every year into the Future Ireland Fund. We will allow it build up until the beginning of the 2040s. And of course, there are risks and there are assumptions that we have to make in developing that plan, but it will help to future-proof our finances and the Irish economy. And briefly, the second fund then is focused on infrastructure, nature and climate, and it is essentially designed to get away from the stop-start approach to public capital investment. So next time we encounter a shock or a downturn, we won't have to hit the brakes when it comes to the public capital programme. We'll have a pot of funding put away so that we can maintain a consistently high level of public capital investment in housing, education, healthcare, transport, renewable energy infrastructure, and so on.
And it transfers into that governed by a fiscal rule? Where does because on the first fund, I understand it's a regular 0.8% contribution.
Yeah.
But
so
on the second
fund, the infrastructure fund, is essentially €2 billion per annum for 7 years. So the plan is to allow it to grow to €14 billion. There will be an annual assessment. We have an independent fiscal watchdog who will carry out an assessment, and I and future ministers of finance then will make a recommendation as to whether or not there has been a deterioration or perhaps a significant deterioration in the economic and fiscal position of the state. And depending on what conclusion is reached, that allows for a pause in terms of additional transfers into the funds, and then there's criteria for actually accessing the funds as well.
Understood. I'd like to ask you about the OECD two-pillar agreement, which Ireland is part of and is implementing. You've already mentioned Ireland's very welcoming status to FDI. A lot of American companies have set up their European headquarters there. One of the factors that was attractive was Ireland's low corporate taxation. That will now have to be a little bit higher, from 12.5 to 15%, and not for all firms, I understand, only for some of them. So if you could explain to our audience what the change will be and how you see this filtering into attractiveness for FDI, whether you think it might be a problem or whether you can deal with it.
It was a very significant public policy decision by the government to sign up to the OECD agreement back in October 2021, and moving away from the certainty that we had for a number of decades of a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which was one part of our offering to the FDI community. There were many others, including talent, stable political system, commitment to European Union membership, being English speaking, common law, and so on. All of that was important as well. But tax was and remains a consideration in terms of foreign direct investment. So for the largest companies, in line with the agreement, where the revenues are in excess of €750 million, the rate in Ireland now is 15%. So I transposed the EU minimum tax directive into Irish law in the form of our annual finance bill late last year, and that came into effect on the 1st of January this year, though the additional revenues, that additional 2.5%, which is being implemented in the form of a qualified domestic top-up tax, doesn't actually flow until mid-2026. So that will be when Ireland will get the benefit of Pillar 2 in terms of the new minimum rate of 15%. But of course there is another pillar, Pillar 1, which will ultimately come at a cost to Ireland, and that involves the reallocation of taxing rights away from smaller countries to larger market-based economies. And overall we do anticipate that there will be a net cost to Ireland from the full implementation of both pillars. So Pillar 2 is agreed and is being implemented in full by us. Pillar 1 continues to be negotiated, and we do want there to be an outcome, because we think it's important that we reach a point of tax peace where we have a certainty and stability about what the international tax
what would be an outcome you'd be satisfied with?
Well, there are details that are still being negotiated, and it is complex, but we do hope that there will be agreement on the multilateral convention over the period ahead. And of course that will require a critical mass of countries to sign up and actually implement the Multilateral Convention, and of course it can't happen without the United States being involved and actually implementing it. So we're at the table, we're involved in the negotiations. I get regular updates from my team. It will come at a cost to Ireland overall. I think it's a price worth paying if we get stability on tax policy, and we then have to focus on the other levers and the other considerations that are important to investors. And I've mentioned a number of those. There are things we can do on tax. We have a very attractive research and development tax credit in Ireland, which I improved in the last budget from 25 to 30%.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. So on the license boxes, the R&D measures you have in place, they might fall under the negotiations for Pillar 1, right? So are you looking for there to be sort of rules of the road, transparency on this? But you probably do still want there to be some exemptions and possibilities to attract R&D. That's the objective, right, for Pillar 1?
Yeah, we have a carve-out of the R&D tax credit as part of the agreement. And so if we hadn't increased the rate of the credit, and in Ireland it's a very straightforward refundable tax credit, if we hadn't increased it to 30%, the impact of its interaction with Pillar 2 would have been a diminution in the value of that tax credit for the in-scope businesses. So we have increased it to 30%, which maintains the real value of that credit. But then for all of the businesses outside the scope of Pillar 2, so all of the smaller businesses in Ireland, they continue to pay 12.5%. That's their rate. So we kept it for all businesses that are below that level of turnover, and they benefit from the increase in the research and development tax credit. So we believe that fair tax competition is legitimate. It is a public policy tool, but we do accept that in an increasingly integrated and digitalized world, we need a common set of rules, and that's why we felt overall, on balance, signing up to this agreement was the right approach for Ireland. And I have to say we got incredibly strong backing from the foreign direct investment community, who we have engaged with. We have a very consultative approach. So when we introduce changes to our tax system, for example, we're committed to introducing a participation exemption in the finance bill later this year. We have consultation, we issue feedback statements, and we engage directly with industry so that we hear their voice, and that gives them a sense of ownership as well about the direction of policy.
Thank you. One final question about the fiscal side, although this is pivoting to the EU part of our interview. There has been an agreement among EU finance ministers, of which you are one, on new fiscal rules. This is a very long-standing debate, one that really you can end up tied up in knots, and sometimes it has happened, but the Spanish finance minister was here this morning, and we managed to commend him on actually managing to deliver under his presidency on a new consensus. But I was wondering how you feel about the new rules, and given that there's a sort of mix outside the rules, there might be excessive deficit procedures, but then there is new flexibility in the rules, both in terms of investment and also in the debt reduction path. So Ireland's debt burden is really much, much lower than it was 12 years ago. Very, very impressive debt reduction path. So I was wondering if at this point that part of the rules is even relevant to Ireland, whether you feel you want to avail of this new flexibility on debt reduction, given that you've done quite a good job so far, and then on the investment side, how Ireland might avail of the new rules in that way.
Well, first of all, there being an agreement and there being a new set of rules is a good thing, because we know from experience in the European Union, where something goes wrong in one or more member states, it can cause contagion. So having a common rule book which is enforced is a positive, and the old rules were, I think, not fit for purpose, and of course were deactivated then over the last number of years during COVID-19 and so on. So it's a positive that we have rules. Because of the strength of Ireland's fiscal position at this point in time, it is the Irish government that will set the medium-term fiscal path. So in the autumn we will have to lay out a new 5-year plan, but that won't be set for us by the European Commission, because we're in a budget surplus, and at least as measured debt to GDP, we have a relatively low level of debt relative to the overall size of the economy. Our debt to GDP is in the region of 40%. Debt to GNI star would be in the mid-70s, but it is falling. So because of that, the Irish government will have the autonomy to actually set its own medium-term fiscal path. But of course, for countries generally, there is inbuilt flexibility that if they wish to do more on investment, if they're genuinely committed to reforms and they're showing a pathway to introducing reforms, there are added flexibilities within the rules. So overall, I think it's a good thing. Ireland is not directly impacted in the sense that we retain the independence to set our own medium-term fiscal path, but it just reaffirms and underlines the importance of sound management of public finances, that you retain fully in control.
Thank you. I have two more questions before we have to wrap up. The first is on European defence bonds. The Atlantic Council has many centres, many of which focus on defence, on supporting Ukraine. In the Geoeconomic Centre, we're obviously part of that because economics is part of the toolkit, but often we manage to isolate ourselves and look at our charts, etc. But this is one of these occasions where there's an overlap. There are ideas floating around in Europe about increasing defence budgets by borrowing collectively. You've made comments recently suggesting that Ireland would oppose this, and you connected it to the debate around the European currency, around risks for that, risks on taking on too much debt when there already is a lot of debt. But I was wondering if you could clarify whether it really is to do with risks to do with the Eurozone, to do with debt, or perhaps something more to do with Irish neutrality. What are the factors behind your opposition to this idea?
Well, first of all, we haven't seen any proposal,
okay.
And so there are no details of what some member states may have in mind in terms of common debt issuance in respect of defence spending. So let's allow that to be put on the table, and it will be examined. But common debt issuance generally in the European Union is contentious. It happened during the pandemic with the overall facility that was put in place under Next Generation EU. But I think a lot of member states would require quite some convincing to sign up to common debt issuance for any issue, whether it be defence or indeed for any other purpose of public spending. Of course, Ireland is not a member of NATO. We are militarily neutral, but that does not prevent us from fully participating in all of the discussions and indeed decision making when it comes to security and defence matters at European Union level.
My final question is on your week here, the spring meetings. Ireland's obviously a very strong supporter of the two main institutions that are hosting these discussions, the IMF and the World Bank. You're Ireland's governor at both, which means that you will have to have an opinion on questions to do with reform, even quota reform. Don't know if we need to go down that rabbit hole now, but a more general question on how you feel these meetings are going, whether you think the focus is right at this point, how you would like to see the institutions evolve. What's your stance on those? And obviously, you've been the governor for a little while now. We wanted to ask you these questions last year, and there was a very successful visit of President Biden's to Ireland, which meant that you couldn't come to see us. But now that you have, I think, 18 months as
almost,
governor at both institutions, you perhaps have a little more exposure to some of the advantages, some of the things that need to be changed. So what is your stance on all that?
I think these institutions have never been more important because multilateralism is under threat, and while the institutions are imperfect and because of their vast scale, decision making can be difficult and it can be slow at times. We have to continue to engage and we have to find ways forward. So for Ireland, we have real skin in the game. We're a small, open, trading economy that I think does punch above its weight in a whole range of different international fora. So we support engagement, collaboration. We want to break down barriers, and we really don't want to see more barriers being put up, because we have benefited enormously from our membership of the European Union, from international trade. We pivoted 60 years ago or so from being a country whose economic policy was characterized by protectionism to one that was outward looking and it was focused on international trade. And I think these institutions here can play a very important role in extolling the benefits and the virtues of multilateralism, not just when it comes to the economics and international trade, but also tackling the great challenges of our time, whether it be addressing conflict or climate change, tackling poverty, reducing inequality in the world. These institutions have never been more important.
Thank you. And that means we're at time. So thank you, Minister McGrath, for coming to see us.
Thank you, Charles.
It's been very, very interesting to talk about, well, just everything that's in your remit, from the domestic Irish economy, EU fiscal reform, and also your position as governor on the two institutions that are hosting these meetings. So this is, it concludes, in fact, day 3 of the Atlantic Council's side meetings to the spring meetings. It's been a very busy week for us, and it is accelerating, so you can look at our program for the next 2 days, which involves a lot of very interesting speakers, panels at our pop-up studio at the IMF, and some wonderful guests here at the Atlantic Council, governors of central banks, finance ministers, and a few surprises as well. So make sure you have a look at our website, and see you soon.